Okay, welcome to this new session of the Leuven seminar. And the seminar is devoted to Kant's account of common sense in the third critique. Before introducing our speakers, I'd like to ask everyone to switch on their camera, if at all possible, because it can be nice to see each other. And I also wanted to mention that normally we keep open the meeting after the formal part, so everyone is invited to stay on for more informal conversations. So I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce our speaker, Jessica Williams, and the respondent, Nuria Sanchez Madrid. Jessica Williams is Associate Professor at the University of South Florida, and her research focuses on Kant's epistemology and aesthetics. She wrote in particular a number of papers on the latter topic, Kant's aesthetics, and I'd like to mention three of her recent publications that I think are very relevant to the session today. Yeah, so I have the impression, Jessica, that you're working on a bigger project and presenting us parts of it. So the first article I would like to mention is on Kant on aesthetic attention, published in the British Journal of Aesthetics in 2021. Two other papers have been published in 2024, one titled A Kantian Account of Aesthetic Communitarianism in Philosophical Topics, and another one titled Autonomy and Community in Kant's Theory of Taste, published in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. We also have a respondent, as usual, Nuria Sanchez Madrid. She is a professor of philosophy at Complutense University in Madrid. Nuria is the director of a research group on normativity, emotions, discourse, and society. She has published widely in areas such as the history of political ideas, moral and political philosophy, philosophy of action, cultural theory, and anthropology. So her research really has a very wide scope. Among her publications, I'd like to mention a monograph on Hannah Arendt, titled Hannah Arendt, La filosofia frente al mal, published in 2021, and two very recent publications on Kant's philosophy, and both of them, interestingly enough, deal with Kant's views on economical issues. The first of these two articles is titled Kant on Labor Relations, an account of economic dependence from the perspective of social philosophy. And this article was published in Philosophy of the Social Sciences. The second article I'd like to mention is titled Who is the Caregiver in Kant's Theory of Labor? Examining Social Domination in Classical German Philosophy, published in Kantian Review. Before I give the floor to Jessica, I'd like to mention the structure of the session. Jessica will give a talk for about 40 minutes. After that, Nuria will give her comments, and this will take about 10 minutes. And after that, Jessica will have the opportunity to briefly respond to Nuria's comments. And after that, the floor is open for the discussion. Let me recall the title of Jessica's talk, The Different Senses of Aesthetic Common Sense in Kant's Third Critique. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you for hosting this, and also thank you everyone for being here today. As Karen mentioned, this is in fact part of a larger project, and I have recently been working on the notion of aesthetic common sense in Kant, and then sort of realized at a certain point that I still didn't understand this notion. And so kind of what I'm doing in this paper, so this is hopefully going to be a chapter of the book that I'm working on, is I just kind of wanted to sit down and really carefully look at the different usages of this term in the third critique, and to also kind of start trying to kind of chart the interpretive landscape a little bit and kind of get clear on the different interpretations. So this is kind of in a rough draft of where I am right now, and a lot of moving parts. So hopefully we can keep track of these as we go. But thank you so much for working through this. So there is a link in the chat for those of you who are here. There's a link to the handout, and I'm also going to try to share my screen for those who can't access the handout. And let me see, go ahead and do this. Okay, let's see if I can. Okay. So where I want to start off is with kind of acknowledging the importance of this notion of aesthetic common sense for Kant's theory. And I think one of the places that you kind of get a hint at how important this notion is that in section 22, which is at the end of Kant's kind of analysis of the beautiful, he's kind of summing up what he's done so far. And he says that the different elements of taste that he has identified throughout this analysis are united ultimately in the idea of a common sense. So this idea that common sense is the kind of culminating notion of his analysis of judgments of beauty, I think should signal how important this notion is for understanding his aesthetic theory. And it's kind of striking that it's often goes with very little commentary. So there are some people who have paid attention to common sense, but I think until relatively recently, there hasn't been as much attention to common sense as other kind of central notions in Kant's aesthetics. But more recently, I think we've seen a lot more attention to common sense, both I think this recognition of the importance of this notion, but also kind of connecting it to these other kind of topics in Kant's aesthetics. So in particular, my own work and Samantha Thurn's work on aesthetic autonomy and how common sense figures in that. And also kind of connecting this notion of aesthetic common sense to Kant's epistemology. So there's, I think, some really good recent work on that as well. So that's all just to say that I think it would be good to get clear on what aesthetic common sense is in Kant. But as it turns out, that's not exactly an easy thing to do. And I think one of the main sources of difficulty for interpreting common sense is that Kant characterizes it or describes it in these very different ways. So here on the handout, you see, so he describes common sense as a sense or a feeling. He also describes it as the principle governing judgments of taste. He characterizes it as an ideal norm and also as a faculty. So some questions that kind of come up in relation to this, right? How should we understand these various characterizations of common sense? How do they relate to each other? Is this just, as Paul Guyer suggests, right? Is this just a source of confusion? So I think trying to figure out what's, I think, going on with these different characterizations and how they fit together is important. And then there's also these puzzles, even if we kind of, as you'll see, I'm going to kind of focus on each one of these characterizations. But even for each one of these characterizations, there are various kind of textual and philosophical puzzles that arise in thinking through these. But it seems to me that it's good to kind of just do this work of kind of trying to separate out these different characterizations and kind of identify what some of the puzzles and questions are for each of these characterizations. So that's kind of the first goal of this paper, is to just kind of get clarity about common sense by working through each of these characterizations, and hopefully to kind of shed light on why Kant is characterizing aesthetic common sense in these different ways. And then this also, I think, for me, it kind of connects to this larger project that I'm working on that has to do with the social dimension of judgments of beauty. And so I think common sense is really central to that understanding of the social dimension of beauty. And I think there's a lot of recognition that when Kant is talking about common sense, he really does have in mind something that is communal. And I'm trying to kind of understand the different ways in which common sense is communal. So then that's going to kind of map on to these different characterizations of common sense. So I want to kind of ultimately suggest that common sense as a sense is a communal or shared feeling for beauty. and that this feeling then serves as a kind of principle for making judgments of beauty. And then there's this also, I think, this further notion of common sense as a faculty. And there, what is communal is sort of not just a kind of shared feeling that you can have, for example, even when you're alone, but that Kant is there kind of invoking shared practices of aesthetic reflection. And these are still things that I think inform judgments that you are making and reflection that you are doing when you're on your own. But I think they also kind of build on and are situated in a kind of understanding of aesthetic reflection as a social practice. So kind of the faculty of common sense is, I think, is shaped by these communal practices. And then I think there's also, as I mentioned, this kind of fundamental shared feeling or communal feeling that is at the heart of judgments of beauty. So I'm trying to kind of track the different ways in which common sense is a communal sense, as I'm also trying to work through these different characterizations or descriptions of common sense. Okay. So I want to look first at Kant's characterization of common sense as a sense. And first, just kind of go through a little bit of the textual support for thinking of common sense as a sense. And I do want to say that there's a way in which this kind of most fundamentally we should think of common sense as a sense. And this is, I think, the where we're going to kind of build from in the understanding of common sense. But I think in thinking about what common sense is, the starting place is Kant's characterization of it as, in fact, a sense. When Kant first introduces common sense in section 20 of the text, and here, this is again at the kind of the culmination of his analysis of beauty, and he introduces it in the context of the modality of judgments of taste, namely that they make this claim to necessity, and the condition of the necessity of judgments of taste, Kant is going to argue is common sense. And he gives us this definition of common sense. He says, we don't mean any external sense, but rather the effect of the free play of our cognitive powers. So, of course, if you know Kant's, theory of taste in the Third Critique, this has to do with the harmony of the faculties of imagination and understanding. So he describes the faculties of imagination and understanding as in a state of free play. And that free play is felt with pleasure. And it's that pleasure, which is a disinterested pleasure, the sort of disinterested pleasure in free play, is the ground of a judgment of beauty. And so here he's connecting common sense, I think, back to his discussion of this disinterested pleasure in the free play of our cognitive powers. And the contrast here, when he says we don't mean an external sense, what Kant is in part indicating is that he's understanding common sense. And here he's somewhat in line with his British predecessors in thinking of this as an inner sense or an interior sense. So common sense is going to be an inner sense, not an external sense. And then he's going to talk about, so one thing I think that's important is that even though he doesn't introduce common sense until sort of later in his analysis, until section 20, if we look back at previous discussions, we see that Kant's already anticipating this when he's talking about the sensation or the feeling that is involved in a judgment of beauty. So, for example, in section 9, which is a very important section, right, he says that when a representation animates or stimulates our faculties, we have a sensation of the effect. So again, we should connect this back to his description in section 20, right? The effect that consists in the facilitated play of both powers of the mind, imagination and understanding, enlivened through mutual agreement. And he says, right, the subjective unity of the faculties and free play can make itself known only through sensation. Okay, so this idea that we have this sensation of the animated play of our faculties. So other texts along these lines in section 15, Kant writes that the judgment is called aesthetic precisely because its determining ground is not a concept, but the feeling of inner sense of that unison in the play of the powers of the mind. So I think here, the feeling of inner sense, he's already anticipating what he's then going to call common sense in section 20. And then back much later in the text in section 40, the aesthetic power of judgment, rather than the intellectual, can bear the name of a communal sense, if indeed one would use the word sense, of an effect of mere reflection on the mind, for there one means by sense the feeling of pleasure. So one quick comment on this, you'll notice that in these passages, Kant is using the terms kind of sense, sensation, and feeling interchangeably. So he explains this very early on in the text, that sensation is the sort of more general category. And then he divides sensations into objective sensations and subjective sensations. So objective sensations are those that are basically, in virtue of which we can ascribe properties to objects, right? So my sensation of green, I'm going to attribute that as a property to the plant in front of me right now, right? It has green leaves. So it's a sensation of mine, but then one that I'm attributing to the object. I take it to correspond to a property of the object. Subjective sensations Kant identifies with feelings, where there you're not getting any cognition of the object. Instead, right, this is just about your own sort of subjective response to an object. So these are, as he says, merely subjective sensations, and he calls those feelings. But he continues to use the word feeling and sensation kind of interchangeably throughout the text. But for our purposes, I think what matters here is that there's, I think, a lot of textual indication here that what common sense is a kind of most fundamentally a sense or a feeling. But I think even if we grant that kind of fundamental characterization of common sense as a sense or a feeling, there's still a lot of disagreement or very kind of different characterizations of what it is a sense of, right? So even if you think common sense is as some kind of inner sense, what is it that it is allowing us to sense? And we get different answers to this kind of in the scholarly literature. And one thing that I'll note about this is that especially for the first two interpretations that I gloss here, interpreters don't always clearly distinguish these in their characterization. So I've tried to distinguish them here, but I think Henry Allison and Beatrice Longinus, for example, kind of run these together in their interpretations. But I'm going to try to kind of separate them out as different interpretations of what common sense is a sense or feeling of. So the first way that this gets characterized is that it's a sense or a feeling of or for the universal communicability of our state of mind. The second is that this is the sense or feeling of the free play of the faculties, or rather it's the kind of the feeling of pleasure in the free play of the faculties. And the third kind of interpretive option here is that it's a sense or feeling of the relation of the faculties of imagination and understanding more generally. Okay, so I kind of want to look at each of these interpretations. I think the reason that you might favor this kind of first way of thinking about common sense is that Kant does emphasize that judgments of beauty sort of rest not only on a feeling of pleasure, but a feeling of pleasure that is universally communicable. And in fact, it's the universal communicability of the pleasure that is the ground of the judgment, as he says in section 9. And I've kind of done a lot of reconstructive work here on Allison's gloss of this. I don't think he's exactly explicit about this, but as I'm reading his account, the idea here seems to be that we must have a feeling for the universal communicability of our state of mind, and that common sense is something like the feeling of this universal communicability, which then kind of grounds our judgment of beauty. So it's somehow like a feeling or a sense of your state of mind as being universally communicable. The problem with this, I think, is that it's not clear to me that universal communicability is something that you could sense or feel. At least to me, that seems like a kind of property that you could only determine with judgment. I think kind of more systematic reasons for thinking that it's not universal communicability, although this is already kind of anticipating the kind of positive view here, is that if you think that that subjective sensations, and in particular feelings of pleasure and displeasure, are meant to kind of clue us into our subjective state, and either maintain us in that state in the case of pleasure, or try to get us out of that state in the case of displeasure. Universal communicability isn't a state that you're in that a sensation would be trying to track in order to maintain you in that state or get you out of that state, right? So the universal communicability is a kind of higher level property of the underlying state. And so I think it's not the kind of thing that you would sense or feel. So that's why I don't think that's the right interpretation. I think most of the kind of textual evidence speaks in favor of the second interpretation. So Kant, as you notice in his very kind of definition that we started with of common sense, he says it's, and I'm going to scroll up here, right? It's not an external sense, but the effect of the free play of our cognitive powers, right? And in these passages you see, in the one from section 15, for example, right, it's the feeling of inner sense of that unison in the play of the powers of the mind. So there's a lot of, I think, textual evidence that speaks in favor of this view, that it's the sensation of or rather it's the feeling of pleasure in the free play of the faculties. So I think there's a lot of textual support for this second interpretation. And of course, right, Kant says, he explicitly identifies the effect of the free play of our cognitive powers with the feeling of pleasure. So I think it looks like, so all of these places where he's talking about the sensation of free play, and then in other passages where he's identifying that sensation or that feeling with pleasure. So there it looks like, okay, common sense is either, you can think of it either as the sense itself or as the capacity to sense or feel the free play of the faculties with pleasure. So I do think that the textual evidence largely speaks in favor of this second interpretation. I think a problem for the second interpretation is Kant's argument in section 21. So after he introduces common sense in section 20, immediately in section 21, he considers this question of whether we have good reason to assume that there's a common sense. And he gives this argument about, he appeals to the universal communicability of cognitions and judgments. And he says that, in addition to being able to communicate our cognitions and judgments, we need to be able to communicate the kind of subjective state that has given rise to those judgments. And then he goes on to say that, there's this disposition of the mind, or disposition of the understanding and imagination, which is suitable for cognition. And that the way that we determine that is through feeling. And thus, in order for this universal communicability of our state of mind, we must have a common sense as the presupposition of this universal communicability of our state of mind. So that's a kind of rough gloss of Kant's argument in section 21. But I think the thing to notice about the argument in section 21 is that Kant is appealing to cognition more generally. And this is a little bit of a puzzle for interpreters is to, why is he talking about common sense in relation to cognition more generally? So if we think of common sense as being limited to the free play and the faculties, then this leads us to see the argument in section 21. So Allison, for example, considers this a digression, admittedly an important one, but it's sort of taking us away from the kind of main thrust of the discussion in sections 20 through 22. Or alternatively, that this section kind of only provides indirect support for the idea of an aesthetic common sense by appealing to, and this is Allison's word, a kind of epistemic or cognitive function of common sense as kind of sensing the relation of our faculties more generally. So I think if you limit common sense to the free play, there's this question of why Kant is appealing to common sense more generally in section 21. And in fact, this has led some interpreters to identify common sense with this more general capacity that Kant seems to be talking about in section 21, this more general capacity to kind of sense the relation of our faculties in general. And this, I think, better accommodates section 21. And it also kind of more big picture connects Kant's account of aesthetic common sense with these questions in epistemology, specifically relating to empirical concept formation. So some recent views doing that, John Msetti has a view along these lines Ido Geiger in his recent book also kind of has a view along these lines, and Samuel Stoner also kind of has this view. But then, of course, there's problems for this interpretation as well. If common sense is the more general ability to sense the relation of our faculties, specifically through feelings of pleasure, right? If any kind of harmony or agreement of the faculties that's suitable for cognition is felt with pleasure, then you have this problem of, well, then wouldn't every cognition be beautiful, right? If there's some pleasure involved in the agreement of our faculties, it seems like all cognition, which has an agreement of the faculties, is going to be beautiful. On Setti's version of this view, she kind of avoids this problem by distinguishing the sensation of our faculties from the pleasure that we feel, and says, hey, it's only in the case of the free play of the faculties that the agreement of our faculties is felt with pleasure. So we always kind of have this sensation, but it's only in free play that it's felt with pleasure. But I don't think that move exactly works. There would still be a question of why we would feel the pleasure in the aesthetic case and not the cognitive case. And I think there's also a question of why Kant would introduce this new kind of sensation. He's already introduced feelings of pleasure and displeasure as the feelings or the sensations through which we are able to determine our own subjective state. And of course, feelings of pleasure and pleasure have that kind of causal function of maintaining us in that state, or getting us out of that state. So he's already assigned this function to feelings of pleasure and displeasure. So I think it would be strange for him to introduce a kind of sui generis sensation, also without telling us that he's doing that. So I think it looks more like it's via feelings of pleasure and displeasure that we're determining the relation of our faculties in general. But then again, we have this question of, well, why isn't everything beautiful? So on the kind of the view of this that I have right now, and again, my own views are kind of developing as I'm working through all of this, but I kind of want to split the difference between the second and the third interpretation here. So I do think that interpreters are right to identify a more general ability to sense the relation of our faculties through feelings of pleasure and displeasure. But then I think that Kant is also sort of reserving common sense to focus specifically on the aesthetic case, where the kind of agreement of our faculties is brought about contingently and without conceptual determination. So I do think that there is cognitive pleasure when there's an agreement of our faculties. I mean, I think there can also be cognitive displeasure when things are especially hard to cognize. But I think that the kind of the pleasure and beauty is going to be different from those cognitive pleasures in a couple of ways. So I think one is going to be in terms of the intensity. I think another is going to be in terms of duration. I think in the case of cognitive pleasure, it doesn't last as long as the pleasure of beauty. And I think there's also this case that the pleasure and beauty is brought about in a different way. It's brought about through aesthetic reflection and free play, and hence involves this kind of contingent agreement of the object. And this, moreover, I think is a way of connecting common sense with Kant's discussion of subjective purposiveness. And so the idea is that the pleasure that we are feeling in the free play of our faculties, right, that's the way in which we're ultimately sensing the subjective purposiveness of an object, right, through this feeling of pleasure in the free play. So common sense is, I think, fundamentally a sense. What is it a sense of? Well, it is a sense of this kind of pleasure in free play, and hence the subjective purposiveness of an object. But that is a particular use of a more general capacity that we have to sense the relation of our faculties through feelings of pleasure and displeasure. Okay. So that's all on common sense as a sense. Kant also in these sections in 20 through 22 is talking about common sense as a principle. So there's this question then about, well, what does it mean to treat common sense as a principle? And Kant identifies it with the subjective principle of taste, right? He's ruled out the possibility of having any objective principles of taste, right? There's no conceptually articulable rules that we can give for determining whether something is beautiful. But he says, right, insofar as these judgments make a claim to necessity, there must be some principle, but it's going to be a subjective principle. And then he identifies that subjective principle with common sense. Okay, so then the question is, how is common sense functioning as a principle? So here I've kind of focused in on a recent interpretation of this in the last week, I've kind of been looking at more interpretations of this. We can talk about that in the Q&A if it comes up. But at least at this stage, I was kind of looking at Samantha Mathern's recent account of the principle of common sense. So the way that she puts this is that it demands that our judgments of taste be grounded in a feeling, namely the disinterested pleasure that results from free play. And on this view, it is only insofar as we take our aesthetic judgments to meet this standard that we are licensed to treat them as examples that others should follow. Okay, so here she's understanding common sense as this demand to ground our judgments of taste in this disinterested feeling of pleasure. I think the problem for this proposal is that a pure judgment of taste for Kant just is a judgment that is grounded on the disinterested pleasure and the free play of the faculties. So I take this demand basically to just amount to the kind of a command to make judgments of beauty. But that doesn't seem to be what Kant has in mind when he's talking about common sense as the principle of these judgments. It's not just the demand or command to make judgments of beauty. It seems to be the way in which we are determining or making the judgment of beauty. So I don't think that this is the right account of the principle of common sense. So my own proposal here is to think that common sense functions as a principle when we subsume the representation of an object under our feeling of pleasure and free play to judge that it is beautiful. And so here, so a couple of points. Partly this is relying on a kind of two acts or two judgment model of the judgment of taste, which originally traces back to Geyer. So Geyer has this model of judgments of taste where there's a kind of initial judgment that arises from our reflection on an object. And then there's a subsequent judgment where we kind of determine that, you know, the feeling is the disinterested feeling of pleasure. And then we make the kind of proper judgment of beauty or judgment of taste. I don't accept the details of Geyer's, in particular, how he's understanding those two steps. But I think I do want to kind of endorse that kind of two steps model for approaching judgments of taste. And this is similar. So this is also recently coming from a paper by Larissa Berger, and she's giving what she calls the kind of subsumption model of judgments of taste. And so here I'm kind of relying on this idea of a kind of subsumption, but what we're subsuming under is our feeling, right? So if you make a cognitive judgment, you're subsuming a representation, right? Whether that's an intuition or another judgment, you subsume it under an objective principle, which is going to be articulable. When you judge that an object is beautiful, there's, I think, a similar kind of process at work, except for kind of in the place of an objective principle, you are using your own feeling. And in fact, I think Kant thinks that the feeling of pleasure in free play is serving as something like a proxy for a rule that we can't state, right? So it seems when we're making the judgment of beauty, it seems as if there's a rule in virtue of which we are judging that something is beautiful. There is no such rule that we can state. And yet our feeling itself, I think, is serving as the rule, right? So when I'm reflecting on the form of an object and I have this feeling, then I'm going to think, oh, in virtue of this feeling, right, I can judge that the object is beautiful. So I think the feeling itself is serving as the principle. And it's right under this presupposition that not just me as an individual, but that judging subjects in general, right, that everybody has this kind of common capacity to sense the subjective purposiveness of an object through their feelings of pleasure and free play, right? It's under this presupposition of this kind of shared sense, right, that judgments of taste can be made, right? So the feeling in particular that I'm subsuming the representation under is what Kant calls a common feeling, right? So I can't subsume it under my private feelings, right? I might have a private feeling that something is pleasing to me, but that's not going to work as a principle. It only works as a principle if I take the feeling to be shared. So, I mean, one kind of question here, I've been thinking of the feeling itself as the principle, but clearly there's also this belief or judgment that that feeling is a common feeling. And I'm sort of not sure exactly where to fit that in here. But I do think primarily it's the feeling that is functioning as the principle, and then not just this kind of demand to make judgments of beauty. Okay, so to kind of sum up where we are thus far, right? The capacity to sense or feel the harmony of the faculties, and hence the subjective purposiveness of an object, is a common or shared capacity. What we are taking pleasure in is also something that is shared, namely the way an object kind of contingently fits or accords with human faculties in general. And we treat this common feeling as a principle when we use it to judge that something is beautiful. Okay, so this is, I'm kind of clustering common sense as a sense and common sense as a principle kind of pretty closely together. And now there's this kind of second cluster of concepts that I want to look at, which is common sense as a faculty, and then common sense as an ideal norm. So in sections 20 through 22 of the text is, I think, where Kant is primarily talking about common sense as a sense or a principle. And then in section 40 of the text, which is after his deduction of taste, this is where he starts talking about taste or common sense as a faculty. So in section 40, which the title of this is On Taste as a Kind of Sensus Communis. And so here he's introducing this kind of more general notion of sensus communis. So not just the aesthetic notion, but this more general notion, which he defines as a faculty for judging that in its reflection takes account a priori of everyone else's way of representing in thought, in order, as it were, to hold its judgment up to human reason as a whole. Right. So this is a more general faculty that Kant thinks is incredibly important, sort of kind of across domains. Right. So this is going to be important cognitively. Right. That he thinks this is a faculty that we employ kind of in making sure that we are making good use of our of cognition and our cognitive capacities. But he's also claiming here that taste or common sense is a kind of this. Right. So it is a kind of this faculty. So this faculty is associated, the more general faculty is associated with these maxims: to think for oneself, to think in the position of everyone else, and always to think in accord with oneself. And the second maxim in particular, to think in the position of everyone else, Kant really kind of closely connects that as the kind of governing maxim of the power of judgment, right? That what's really kind of central for judgment is this idea of thinking in the position of everyone else. Again, this is a more general maxim for sensus communis. And as Kant says, it doesn't strictly speaking belong to the critique of taste, but he thinks that this illuminates what's happening in the case of taste. But just to kind of really quickly state what I think we have thus far, right? Even though there's this more general faculty, Kant is claiming that taste is a kind of faculty of sensus communis. So what does that mean in the aesthetic case? What would it mean for aesthetic common sense to be understood as a faculty? And here I've kind of divided the interpretations into two camps. And in the first camp, there's a focus on this reflective ability to generate an intersubjective perspective. So Rudolf Makriel talks about this in terms of this kind of enlargement of one's thought through imagination. I think this also kind of probably connects to things that Arendt has to say about common sense and the use of imagination. More recently, Karen Gorodzhaisky really emphasizes this idea of taking others' perspectives into account as others. And this kind of more general reflective ability to generate an intersubjective perspective. And the second interpretive camp here is, I think, a more narrow understanding of common sense as a faculty, which is specifically kind of directed at examining the grounds of our judgments. So this is coming from Alix Cohen, who is working on this. She's kind of interested in the aesthetic use of this faculty, but I think more interested in the kind of general use of this faculty of common sense. So she thinks in every case that what common sense is really focused on is kind of identifying the grounds of your judgment to make sure that you have not mistaken subjective grounds for objective grounds. And this is going to be kind of important across the board in domains in Kant's philosophy. Samantha Mathern has given an interpretation of this where really focusing on the aesthetic case, where in the aesthetic case, the kind of potential grounds are all going to be feelings of pleasure. So for example, it could be the feeling of pleasure in the agreeable, which is a merely private pleasure, right? I can't make a universal demand on the basis of something that's a private pleasure. So, right, we might be just having kind of private pleasures in the agreeable. There can be cases, right, where our own interests might interfere with our judgment, right? If I'm the young poet and it matters to me that people think that my poetry is good. I think also, as I've mentioned, I think Kant does allow for cognitive pleasures. So I think there are cases where you can mistake the pleasure of beauty for a cognitive pleasure. I think, for example, that's going on in his discussion of the person who, thinks that the pepper garden with its neat, orderly rows is beautiful, but then after a day or two realizes, no, right? That I was just taking cognitive pleasure in the orderliness of the pepper garden. It's not really beautiful. So here the idea is, and this is on Mathern's view, that what common sense in the aesthetic case as a faculty is enabling you to do is to kind of discriminate between and discern among the various possible sources of pleasure to make sure that the pleasure and is the disinterested pleasure in free play and not one of these other kinds of pleasures. So she's thinking of this as a faculty for, as she puts it, hedonic discrimination, right? This ability to discriminate between or among these different sources of pleasure to make sure that you have judged in accordance with the right kind of pleasure. And again, on her view, common sense as a principle tells you judge in accordance with that pleasure. And then as a faculty, it's what's enabling you to determine, right, the different kinds of pleasures. But as the aesthetic version of Cohen's view. So one thing I want to say is that I think this is absolutely right as far as it goes. I think Kant is very clear that in general, it's important to reflect on the grounds of our judgments, not just in the aesthetic case. But I think he thinks it's especially important in the aesthetic case, precisely because in the aesthetic case, the principle that we are subsuming under is a subjective principle. It's not an objective principle. So as Kant puts it, right, one subsumes under a relation that is merely a matter of sensation, and thus this subsumption can easily be deceptive. So side note, I think this is also kind of support for this idea of common sense as a principle is a case where we're subsuming under a feeling. I think these passages support this idea. But then there's also this idea that because what we're subsuming under is a feeling, right, that we're more prone to deception and we're more prone to being wrong in the case of aesthetic judgments. And thus it's especially important to be able to reflect on the grounds of our judgment to determine that we have judged correctly. So I don't want to deny that. I mean, I think that's right. But I also think that there is a richer notion of reflection and reflecting from an intersubjective perspective that we find in the kind of first camp of interpretations, where on this second view, like the point of like adopting others' perspectives is like just to check, right, your own judgment, right? It's just kind of, I'm just using you to check that my judgment isn't mistaken. But I don't think that that's a very rich notion of kind of intersubjectivity. And I think that something richer is happening in the aesthetic case. And so I want to say it's not just directed at the grounds of our judgments, but also extends to kind of aesthetic reflection on the object more generally. I know I think I'm getting close to time, so I'm going to try to go through this a little quickly. But yeah, here we have made it to this idea of common sense as a regulative idea. So I'm kind of using this as in a way understanding what Kant means when he talks about it as an ideal norm. And I have this long passage here, and I won't read all of this out because we're short on time. But the part I want to draw your attention to is here in the middle, where when he's considering this question of whether common sense is constitutive or regulative, the way that he puts it when he's thinking of it as regulative is in terms of this demand of reason to produce a unanimity in the manner of sensing. So I'm really focusing on this idea of a unanimity in the manner of sensing. I'm going to skip this question of whether common sense is constitutive or regulative. The short answer, I think it's both. But I want to focus here on what it would mean to take common sense as a regulative idea. So here I think of this unanimity in the manner of sensing as being something like actual agreement among an aesthetic community, right? That what we're pushing towards when we're undergoing aesthetic reflection, I mean, it's a more active process, right? When we're engaged in aesthetic reflection, Part of the goal of this is, I think, to reach agreement with others in our judgments, right? I mean, it has to be autonomous, right? It can't just be agreement for agreement's sake, but that ultimately we are aiming at this agreement. How do we do this? And I think the answer is through aesthetic debate and discussion. And here, I think it's nice to turn to Kant's discussion in the antinomy of taste, where he points out that you can't dispute about matters of taste because there are no objective principles. But he does think you can argue about matters of taste. And I think this is such an important part of his theory and really overlooked, is the kind of the role of argument and aesthetic debate and aesthetic discussion. And if you notice, he says, right, the goal of arguing is to try to bring about this unanimity in judgments through their mutual opposition. So I think there's also that parallelism here in this discussion of unanimity. And the way I'm understanding kind of aesthetic debate is that it's not just I say it's beautiful and you say it's not. That's not much of a conversation, right? We're not going to get much unanimity just by doing that. I think we have to think of this as being a kind of richer process where we're describing our experience, we're explaining our experience, we're giving reasons for our experience, even though we recognize that those are not objective principles that can compel somebody else's agreement, right? This is often, directions for attention, or giving background information, right? Did you know this, or did you see this part of it, or this relates to it in this way? So I think this much richer idea of really reflecting on objects in community with others with this goal of agreement. So I have a passage here I won't read, but I think this, for example, is what Kant thinks the role of critics is. It's not to give us objective rules, but to rather kind of teach us how to engage our faculties by kind of working through examples and pointing at these details and the kind of possibilities for free play in a given object or work of art. So if that's right, then I think that this becomes this kind of goal of unanimity, which this is what I'm thinking of as the kind of ideal norm of common sense, as being a kind of regulative idea that is governing the operation of aesthetic reflection or common sense as a faculty, right? That as a faculty, right, we're not just trying to make sure that we've gotten our judgments right, but we're also trying to bring about a kind of actual agreement with others by kind of engaging in these communal practices of aesthetic reflection. Okay, so really briefly to kind of I know there's a lot of moving parts to this, but I kind of want to sum this up here. I do think it helps to kind of take seriously these different meanings of common sense and to not, so I mean, Geyer, for example, thinks, this is just a confusing part of the text. But I think in a way, the reason that we get these different senses of common sense is because of how kind of unique aesthetic judgment is, right? So, I mean, it's on the one hand, it's a form of judgment and hence a faculty, and yet one in which we're judging by means of a feeling. So I think it's kind of not surprising that we would have common sense characterized both as a feeling and as a faculty. So I think those are the kind of two anchors here for my interpretation, is kind of common sense as a feeling and common sense as a faculty, but that's really kind of just tracking what aesthetic judgment is, right? It's aesthetic judgment as a faculty for judging through feeling. And then I think that this also kind of helps us to kind of track the different stages of judgment, where we kind of have a simple reflection on an object in which we kind of feel this free play of our faculties. And then I think we also have a kind of reflection on that as being a common feeling that we share with others, and then in virtue of which we kind of make the judgment of beauty proper. And then I think then thinking of aesthetic reflection or common sense as a faculty is kind of encompassing all of the steps or stages of a judgment of beauty. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up there, and I'll stop sharing the handout here. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. That was wonderful. So we now turn to Nuria Sanchez Madrid for her comments.
Thank you. Just give me a minute to. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, can you maybe also pin Nuria?
Yes. Are we okay now?
Well, so if you see Nuria very well from your screen, then I think we're fine.
Yes,
Okay.
I see completely.
Yes, I think
Thank you. Thank
it's
you for that.
fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you for this kind invitation. I'm very happy to take part again in this Leuven seminar, and I found very thought-provoking this paper by Jessica Williams. I fully follow the arguments and the interpretation she argues for in the whole paper, but I will try to give her also to suggest some remarks and questions that perhaps could be helpful to further develop this very interesting, very stimulating paper. I would like to begin with a very short overview of the main sections, the general structure of this paper. I think it takes seriously the polysemic value of Kant's common sense. This is very clear throughout the paper. But what I find especially insightful in Williams' paper is the aim to go beyond individual characterizations of common sense in order to reconstruct, to offer a reconstruction of the full scope of this concept. So I'm focusing now, Manuel, in slide 2. Thank you. I begin with this shape overview of the main parts of the paper. First of all, Williams tackles the fact that common sense appears in Kant's self-critique as a sense or a feeling. There are different interpretations of this first trait, and in this sense, as she already mentioned in the presentation, I will be very briefly about that. Some interpreters concentrate on the fact that is the universal communicability of our state of mind what is especially important to feel beauty. Other interpreters consider that this is the free play of the faculties, and I mentioned them in this slide. Others consider that is the relation of the faculties of knowledge, it is imagination and understanding, what brings about the sense or the feeling of beauty. And I found especially insightful the following quotation of Williams' paper in the page 11, where she says that the pleasure we feel in a harmonious free play of is distinct from other forms of cognitive pleasure, even though the underlying capacity to feel our subjective state through pleasure or displeasure is the same. This is why not all cognition is beautiful. Put otherwise, not all cognitive pleasure is pleasure in the beautiful. I found very important this claim for the following reason, because from the very beginning of this analytical reconstruction of Kant's common sense, Williams tried to highlight the fact that beauty and common sense, especially as the grounding of beauty, could be considered as something factual or as something intertwined with human agency. And I think it's very important. It's a very key element of the paper, of the whole argument, to try to make this difference from the very beginning, from the first meaning, so to say, of this common sense. I move to slide 3, and we could follow with this meaning of common sense as a principle, so that the subjective principle of taste could be considered, following Kant's terms, as a common feeling. And Williams also in a very compelling form, she argues for the interpretation of the feeling of taste, or of taste as a feeling, as something shared, something common, for not only cognitive subjects, but for subjects having experience of beauty. As she mentions in the paper, for example, in the quotation you find at the beginning of this slide from page 14, there is a logical version of the transcendental principle of purposiveness, which is very helpful for the progress of natural sciences. But Kant also highlight this aesthetic version of the principle of purposiveness, which could not be simply overlap by the logical dimension, or the logical principle of purposiveness, very important for understanding, also to perform, to carry out something as an archaeology of knowledge. I think here also, in the second meaning of the common sense as a principle, we find this aim, which I find very, very compelling, of accurately distinguishing the subjective principle of taste as a common feeling from a more objective principle related with the formal, the transcendental principle of purposiveness. If we move to the third meaning of common sense, also very well known for readers and interpreters of the third critique, common sense is also presented by Kant as a faculty. And in this sense, it's easy to find the comparison, especially in paragraph 40 of the third critique, with a sensus communis. And this sensus communis, as you can follow in the quotation from this paragraph 40 of the Critique of Judgment, the common sense as a faculty, it involves the effort of individual subjects to take into account the point of view of others. So once more, this meaning of common sense entails this agential trait of this shared feeling, of this shared sensus communis. Naturally, we could find in the current state far different lines of reception, of interpretation of this faculty of sensus communis. For example, and I think it's very helpful, the reconstruction of the different positions that Williams display in the paper. McCreel and Gorodeilsky, they support, or they argue for a more positive dimension of common sense than Cohen or Matern, Samantha Matern, who view sensus communis more as something factual that the subjects will be able to discover, just removing the private, the personal or private traits of their aesthetic judgments. Unlike this position, McCreel, Gorodeilsky, but also Jessica Williams argue for to try to put in value this positive dimension of common sense. There is not only a negative requirement and dimension of the common sense, but also a positive dimension which has to do with the production of this common sense as a human commitment, as a commitment to fulfill and to achieve a complete, a full-fledged development of human capacities. And the four meaning of common sense as a regulative idea, I will say that it completely fulfills the goals of some of the previous meanings, insofar as it highlights something very relative with Kant's theory of sensus communis, which is the fact that we could have doubts to consider sensus communis a constitutive principle of the possibility of experience, and thus the interpretation by Cohen or Matern would be more sympathetic, I think, with this kind of account of common sense, or perhaps common sense should be understood as a regulative idea, being commanded stemming from a higher principle of reason, as we find in this passage from the Critic of Judgment, from paragraph 22 of the Critic of Judgment, where, according to Kant, it could be also possible and reasonable that a higher principle of reason makes it into a regulative principle for us to produce a common sense. So this second possibility, which suggests to take distance with regard to a more factual understanding of sensus communis, opens up a very stimulating landscape, which could be lead, for example, for instance, to the connections between aesthetical experience and political deliberation. I think this is a very interesting consequence of this paper. I move to the fourth slide, which tries to suggest to Jessica Williams some textual sources that I think could be also helpful to further develop the argument she has presented in this session. Concretely, I go into the paragraph 60 of the Critic of Judgment, thus the appendix on methodology concerning taste, the appendix of the Critic of Aesthetic Judgment, where Kant concludes after the dialectic of aesthetic judgment, where, as Williams very accurately declares in the paper, where Kant considers that to argue about aesthetic issues, not to dispute, because disputation on relying on objective reasons is not possible in matters of aesthetics, but to argue is a good training. It's a good training to build up something common, something that has to do with common beliefs about what is beautiful, what is not able to achieve the requirements, to meet the requirements of what is beautiful. And so I found in this paragraph, especially in this passage from page 355 of the fifth volume of the academic edition, I find in this passage something that sounds very close to the conclusions of Williams in this paper. I read only this passage I quote in this slide, where Kant considers that it seems that for all fine art, insofar as we aim at its higher degree of perfection, the propedeutic does not consist in following precepts, but in cultivating our mental powers by exposing ourselves beforehand to what we call humaniora. They are called that presumably because humanität, means both the universal feeling of sympathy and the ability to engage universally in very intimate communication. When these two qualities are combined, they constitute the sociability that befits our humanity and distinguishes it from the limitation characteristic of animals. I find in this description of humanity consisting in both this universal feeling of sympathy and this ability to engage universally in very intimate communication, I find something very close to the core of sensus communis, of common sense, according to Williams' interpretation in this paper. And thus I move to very brief last questions that I address to Jessica, and I hope they are helpful to further shape or give shape to this paper. The first one will be: does Kant's common sense entail an aesthetic culture more than a prescriptive pedagogy? We read in this passage from paragraph 60 that there are no prescriptions for getting a higher degree of perfection in the field of beauty. There is no a method for aesthetic, but there are manners. So the only paragraph consisting in this methodology of taste, in this methodology of aesthetic judgment, it argues for these manners of beauty, because there is now this prescriptive pedagogy of it. So does Kant common sense entail this aesthetic culture aiming to fully develop the goals of humanity? It involves something related to human development in it. The second one, the art of arguing about aesthetic matters could be considered a sort of a school of public deliberation for the citizenry, for the universe of people discussing about beauty, about aesthetic issues. The third question: everybody is everybody, including white men, women, children, workers, domestic servants. Should everyone be able to have a valuable point of view about a piece of art, according to the very ambitious aim of paragraph 40 in the third critique? And the last one will it be interesting, in your view, to further inspect Kant's politics of beauty? I take the title from Susan Melchell's Kant Element, The Politics of Beauty. It will worth, in your view, to your mind, to further inspect this Kant's politics of beauty insofar as aesthetics appear as a sort of training, of very stimulating, very promising training to achieve, to develop, to foster political virtues. And this will be my questions, not without expressing my gratitude for being able to read such an interesting paper. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nuria, for a very rich response. Jessica, it's probably hard to limit yourself to a few questions, but please go ahead.
So first of all, Nuria, thank you for those fantastic comments. And also the passage from section 60, which I had thought about before for a different paper and kind of hadn't been thinking about for this one. But I think that it's so helpful too, because especially in the part, you know, that you highlighted, it does seem to have exactly those two dimensions that I've been trying to argue for, both this idea of a kind of shared feeling, and then also the kind of like actually communicating with people, or this, you know, kind of culture of communication. So it's, you know, such a wonderful passage. Thank you for bringing that to my attention again. And I think also does kind of connect to these kind of questions you were asking at the end. So that's one of the places that I think the project is going, is I then kind of want to think through what it means then to develop common sense as a faculty for this richer kind of social reflection. And you know, Kant does, you know, he gives hints about this with respect to pedagogy, and in particular this idea of having a kind of common set of artworks. I mean, so he thinks instruction in the classics is important for kind of giving us this common aesthetic culture, basically. So he does, I mean, he does have some places, I think, where he's indicating how you develop the aesthetic culture that I think goes along with the full development of common sense as a faculty in this kind of rich communal sense. But then I think there's also a lot of kind of reconstructive work that I want to think about in terms of the details of what that looks like. And I think, right, it's not just pedagogy, although I think that's going to be part of it, but also what a kind of larger aesthetic culture would look like for Kant. And I haven't really thought that much about the political implications of this, but I do think that that connects to the kind of the moral importance. So, you know, when he's talking about common sense as a regulative idea, you know, Kant mentions, is there a higher principle of reason that would lead us to produce a common sense in ourselves? And I do think that that is going to be this moral interest that we have in developing this faculty because of its moral implications, and I think also the political implications as well, that these are the same kind of capacities that you develop in the aesthetic domain that have, I think, these implications in the political or the moral domain. But in terms of my project, I've been thinking about it more in terms of this moral idea of self-development and the way in which we develop ourselves through engaging in and cultivating the faculty of common sense. But I do think there's also all of the political implications, and I just haven't kind of thought about that. But I think that's a nice thing to push me to think about as I am expanding this project. So yeah, there was so much in your comments, and I think I'll just stop there. But yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So I think we can now turn to the other participants. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. Well, if there are no immediate questions, I can maybe start. So I feel like I'm an outsider to, this particular debate in Kant scholarship. But I was wondering what you think of the potential negative aspects of Kant's notion of common sense. And I think this is in line with Nuria's question concerning, well, who's supposed to be able to have these feelings and to experience beauty along Kantian lines. But then the counterpart of that question is, well, who isn't? Yeah, so what are the boundaries within which we can expect members of a community to be able to share a certain norm, or to strive toward this so-called universal communicability? And I think, for instance, in the case of music, it's very clear that that is very that it very much depends on social and cultural conditions, what can be appreciated as beautiful and what cannot. Yeah, so that was one of my thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, which I think is a very important and very hard one. So on the one hand, I think kind of generally an interesting feature of Kant's theory, especially in comparison to someone like Hume's, where for Hume, you have an account of all of the conditions that have to be met for someone to be an ideal judge of beauty. And the thought is there aren't going to be that many ideal judges of beauty. And in a lot of ways, I think Kant gives us a far more egalitarian account of the conditions of judgments of beauty, in relating common sense to the conditions of judgment more generally. And I think part of what he's saying is, if you are capable of making judgments of any kind, you are capable of making judgments of beauty. And so in that way, I think it's a very egalitarian view about what the conditions are, which I think is in contrast to somebody like Hume. At the same time, I think that there's a difference between the treatment of beauty and fine art. So I think beauty is going to be more egalitarian than fine art, because I think Kant acknowledges that there are conditions for the appreciation of fine art. So one of them is, you often, as he recognizes, you need background information, you need certain kinds of training. And as he, I think, also points out, the role of aesthetic ideas in fine art are, I think, what you're trying to present in fine art for Kant is always going to be something universal, but I think that he implicitly recognizes that the various symbols and metaphors that you would use to do that would be culturally conditioned. And in a way, that's, I think, why he focuses a lot on the importance of having a common set of artworks when you're training people in, reflective judgment, is that I think he kind of recognizes that you want a sort of common pool of symbols and metaphors that you're drawing from in creating fine art, so that the artist can successfully communicate aesthetic ideas. But that's to say that I think fine art is far more open to these kinds of cultural and social differences, given Kant's own view. I think given the way that aesthetic ideas get depicted by artists through things like symbols and metaphors, which are culturally specific, there I think you can have a lot of difference, and also I think require a lot more background information, right? Oftentimes you're just not in a position to appreciate a work of fine art if you don't have the relevant understanding in order to grasp the aesthetic idea that's trying to be communicated to you. And so I think that's compatible with what Kant says about the universality of beauty, that I think in some cases that's going to have many more conditions on being able to appreciate it in the case of fine art. But at the same time, I think Kant does still have this kind of egalitarian view where it's just kind of built into the package of judgment, that if you can make judgments, you can appreciate beauty. And I think far more egalitarian than somebody like Hume.
Okay, thank you very much. Other questions from the audience? Thanos?
Hello. Thank you, Jessica, for your really wonderful talk and very interesting topic. So just to continue of your last thoughts, when we talk about sensus communis as a regulative idea, the way I understand the text, there is a premise by Kant that all human beings share the same faculties. And that premise plays a role in the argument of sensus communis as a regulative idea, because we adopt the standpoint of others, but not the actual standpoint of others, but a normative standpoint, what they should have judged about this object, assuming that we experience the same object and assuming that we also share the same faculties. But given what you just said about art, which I of course agree with, doesn't this kind of restrict the universality in question? And exactly where does this feature in the argument? Should we say then that someone who's not aesthetically educated or trained, let's say in a certain culture, would have an imagination or an understanding that could not reach a certain point and then could not reach the point where there is this free play of the faculties, and then that doesn't seem to fit in so well with Kant's very explicit statement that when this happens, I mean, when the two faculties are harmonized in free play, then the subjective conditions of cognition in general and of communication have met. So I don't have an answer for this. I'm just wondering your thoughts, and maybe a side question on this is whether you think this is not a problem in judgments on the beauty of nature, and it is only a problem with art.
Yeah, so I'll answer this, maybe that second question first. So I do think that it's more of a problem, as it were, in the case of fine art. But I do think people can be blocked in various ways, even in relation to natural beauty. So I mean, I think there's still a situation where the thought is, if you were to engage your faculties in aesthetic reflection, you would judge this to be beautiful, but you are, for whatever reason, unwilling to put yourself in the position to aesthetically reflect on an object in the right way. So I think that happens even in the experience of beauty, right? Right, and this is like so often if you are out somewhere on a hike and you're with, you see families and they've got teenagers and they're on their phones, and there's a kind of like, no, look, you have to look, you're not appreciating the natural beauty right in front of you. So I mean, I think even there can be conditions that keep people from engaging their faculties in the right way to experience the free play. But then I think in the case of, I mean, so often I think in the case of natural beauty, it's just, just look, right? And in the case of a lot of fine art, that it's not that simple, right? Where I think there are many more conditions for appreciating fine art. But I think in a way, that's why we need the regulative idea of common sense. Because I think part of this is something, it's a norm that is pushing you to develop your faculties. And I think also pushing you to try to understand those things that you don't understand, right? And so I think there is a kind of failure on the part of someone who's unwilling to do any of the work to understand works of art, and also works of art from different cultures, for example, or challenging pieces of music, right? So there is, I think, a kind of work that you have to do. But then I think that's also, right, that's why we have a regulative idea of common sense, as it's important to do this work, because in doing this work and in coming to greater aesthetic appreciation of a wider range of objects, I think that also then has these moral and political implications. So I think we do have good reason to do that, but I think often, people are prohibited in various ways. And sometimes it can be a failure of not on, it's not a personal failure. It's just if you haven't had the right kind of aesthetic education or the right kind of exposure, you're not going to be in a position to do this. But I think sometimes it can be the personal failure of not having pushed yourself more to engage with a wider range of works of beauty.
Okay, thank you very much. Nuria, do you have a follow-up question, or just
a follow-up? But I think there are more questions asked. I see more hands up.
Okay, so then
I could wait. I have no problem. It's
okay, that's perfectly fine. And as you know, we have an informal part, yes. So there will be more time later on. Shahab, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jessica. It was very interesting. I have a question with regard to the relation of actual society or culture with the universal communicability of aesthetic judgments. So my question is maybe quite simple. I would like to know whether the universal communicability of our aesthetic judgments presuppose the sociality of the human being, or it grounds the sociability of the human being. Especially, I ask it not with regard to the judgments of artistic beauty, but judgments of natural beauty. Yeah.
This is a great question. And if anything, I want to maybe ask you what's behind the question. My impulse is to say yes, but I don't know that I have a worked out answer for that. I think I have things buzzing, but my temptation is to say that it does, that there is a kind of presupposition of sociability, even for the universal communicability that's kind of built into the judgment. So, I mean, on my view, there's kind of the universal communicability or shared feeling, but that's the kind of thing that you can in principle experience even when you're alone. And then there's also this idea of common sense as a faculty that you develop in actual community with other judgers. But at the same time, I think there still is a presupposition of that kind of sociability, even in the universal communicability. But I don't know that I have the fleshed out story as to why. But so I'm kind of curious if you have views on this, or what's lurking behind the question.
I think you already mentioned it, because I think the Kant says on the one hand, he says that so judgments of natural beauty, I mean, an individual can have judgments of natural beauty even if that individual is living in an island, like isolated from everyone. But he also says that we can like develop our taste of aesthetics with regard to nature to have a better sense or feeling of the beauty, and also maybe we also develop our moral sense in by doing so. So I see the tension here, and I wanted to know your opinion with that regard. But I think it's maybe it's really difficult to say it according to Kant's text. I think both sides are present in the text, maybe.
Yeah. One thing I do want to say is I think that one way in which it presupposes sociability is that I think that part of the pleasure of beauty and part of the judgment of beauty is that it extends to others. And so I think if part of what you're taking pleasure in, even when you're alone, is that you're having an experience that is shareable with others, then that presupposes the others already when you're kind of by yourself. But that's a different way of presupposing others than a point about, oh, and you also have to develop your faculties in an actual community. You have to get an aesthetic education. Pedagogy is playing a role here. Critics are playing a role. So there's all of that actual community that I think is playing a role. But I think there's also that kind of presupposition of it already in the universal communicability. If what part of what you're taking pleasure in is that it's not just your private experience, but one that extends to others.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Manuel?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica, for your talk, and also for both of you for the discussion. My question goes a little bit beyond the scope of your paper, but I was wondering what are your thoughts on this problem of the common sense, or let's say the sociability of the judgment of beauty, when we address the problem of the sublime, because this seems to be a bit like ambiguous, because on the one hand there is this this tension between the faculties, and we don't have this form of the free play or the harmonious free play. So we could think, okay, the sublime is just more private, that but at the same time there is all this dimension of the sublime as opening for the moral concept of the human being. So I don't know, what are your, if you have ideas about this?
Yeah, I don't have worked out views about this. There are these notable differences. So I mean, one is that Kant, there's more of a condition on the experience of sublime, because if you haven't developed certain moral sensitivities, then he thinks you're not in a position to experience the sublime. At least not the dynamically sublime. Maybe you could the mathematically sublime, but not the dynamical sublime. So there's, I think, more of a condition on experiencing sublimity. But yeah, I think sublimity seems to be, I mean, it is a judgment that's, I think, not merely private. So it's like beauty in that respect, in having kind of a universality to the judgment. And yet I think without the kind of social dimension that you have with judgments of beauty. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because I should think about this in relation to the sublime. Yeah.
I guess that might become a different paper altogether.
Yeah.
Or okay, are there further questions? So Thomas, again, I'm also looking at participants who haven't yet contributed and maybe have other questions too. If not, then yes. Now I'm maybe Nuria, would you like to briefly make your comments?
Okay, thank you. Just a short query following Jessica's response to my previous remarks. I was wondering about this point regarding the common sense as a regulative principle. I fully agree with you about the fact that this higher principle enforcing or giving us the energies enough to build up this common sense, and not to grant that is a factual principle in our society, in our social intercourse. I fully agree that this principle should be moral, because it could not be understandable according to Kant's method and to Kant's aims, that something different from morals could suggest to take such a path. But my point, my take regarding this definition of common sense will be whether you will follow an argument supporting that perhaps this moral motivation to make of beauty a culture could bring about as a byproduct, as perhaps a non-expected consequence, to train people to tolerate the opinions of others, the point of view of others, and so become a kind of sort of political training for the entire society, for the community, so to say, for the community of people reacting to the existence of beauty, or to the experience of beauty. So I was curious about how to classify this political byproduct in the sphere critique. Perhaps I'm too influenced by Hannah Arendt's reading of Kant. This is also my impression, but I will be happy to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah. Maybe one way to connect them is, and I think Brent Kalar maybe has a paper where he kind of suggests something along these lines, is to see the aesthetic community as a version or one possible way that the kind of the ethical community can arise. And I mean, I think the aesthetic community is in some ways a nice model for that, where it is a community that is kind of oriented towards this goal of shared feeling, right? So really kind of a genuine kind of shared feeling, but that one that's also brought about, right? I mean, so I think both of these things, I mean, I haven't talked about this that much today, but I have done work on this before, but this idea that so much of what is involved in aesthetic judgment is autonomy. So you have autonomy on the one hand and community. And so I think the way that these two things come together in an aesthetic community, where you have these autonomous members who are judging for themselves, and yet at the same time trying to bring about shared feeling through their autonomous judgment, it becomes a kind of model for the ethical community. So I mean, I think in other places, kind of friendship sometimes gets talked about in relation to the ethical community, but I think the aesthetic community is a nice candidate for this. And then it's not, I think, exactly a byproduct, but that I think maybe that's part of the sort of demand of reason, is that in the kind of moral motivation has this political element to it. And then it's, I think, yeah. But I think you probably think about this much more than I do. I haven't thought as much about the political
it makes me think about this connection between aesthetics, morals, and also politics. Thank you for the suggestion.
Okay, I think that maybe we can conclude the formal part here. And Thanos, my apologies, but if you can stay on, then we can take your question later on. Before I announce the next session, I'd like to thank once again Jessica and Nuria for their talk and response, and everyone else for their participation. And I also would like to mention our next session, which is on October 30. And this will be a book launch where we will discuss a monograph by Benjamin Berger on Hegel, Schelling and the Philosophy of Nature, published by Routledge in 2023, with various commentators, including Luis Garcia, here present. So evidently, you're very welcome to join us for this session and the forthcoming sessions. Okay, so thanks again, and maybe see you next time or after the recording has stopped.